maybe we can start. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. All right. My name's Jenna Clark. I'm 34 years old. I work as an applied behavioral scientist at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. So this basically means my training is in social psychology, and I use what I know about the real forces behind human behavior to help people make healthier choices in their day-to-day lives. So this is a project that's very resonant for me, given that that's actually what I do in my day job as well. On this sort of health and illness front, I'm diagnosed with idiopathic hypersomnia without long sleep time, and several other things as well. But that was the first and probably the most important diagnosis. On the sort of hobbies and personal interest side, I love reading and writing. I'm very much into hikes, although health limits the kind of level of activity I can get up to. And also newly interested in birding, which thankfully is something you don't have to walk very far to see some beautiful birds. Where I live actually in the Research Triangle here in North Carolina. That's a quick introduction.
And no, thank you. And that was very, very great. And, you know, birding is a great activity for these times, specifically with COVID-19. So wonderful. And so when did you first think or experience, you know, anything or suspect that anything was wrong?
Well, it's interesting because when I look back now, from my current perspective, I can see that I've been sick my entire life. And it just was something that I never realized as a child. A few years back, my husband told me a quote. I can't remember who said it, but it was something along the lines of, I learned as a child never to trust in my body, something like that. That was, as soon as I heard that quote, I was just a little angry that I hadn't come up with it myself, because it just so perfectly encapsulated everything I felt. And from a very young age, I was always very sort of tired, weak, uncoordinated. I couldn't write properly or tie my shoes for a long time, despite the fact I was academically advanced. I was reading at 3, but I couldn't write properly until I was 8 or 9. Until then, I held my pencil like this. So there were all of these little signs, but they never really seemed to be enough to add up to anything, especially as my mother actually has a similar condition to mine, and she is significantly sicker. She is in fact more or less disabled. And so it was one of those things where I could contrast my sort of minor issues and impairments to something, you know, more serious like her condition. And it just kind of came across like, okay, you're making a big deal out of nothing. But there were always signs, you know, like in high school, I would sleep through my US history class every day because the teacher would turn down the lights, turn up the heat, and start teaching on transparencies, which hopefully you don't have too many people on this watching this who will be too young to know what they are. But I would just fall asleep.
I remember them.
Yeah, just fall asleep like clockwork in that class every day. And if you left me like alone in a car for 10 minutes, I'd fall asleep, all of these kind of things. And I just kind of assumed this was normal because I was a teenager, so I was sleeping maybe 7 hours a night. And I thought, oh, well, you're supposed to sleep 8 hours a night. If I only sleep 7, no wonder I can fall asleep at the drop of a hat. It took quite a few years for me to realize that something was genuinely up. I got through college doing fairly well. I didn't study very much, but I've tended to get by without needing too much studying in my life, so I didn't really realize anything was wrong. But then I started working sort of a normal 8 to 5 schedule, and things were really, really difficult at that point. I would set my alarm at 7:45 every morning, wake up, brush my teeth, brush my hair, throw on clothes, and race for like the 1 mile drive to get to work. I couldn't set it any earlier because I had to get as much sleep as possible. I decided to go see a sleep specialist, and I was so sleepy, I forgot about the appointment and I missed it. And so
how long ago was that?
That was actually back in 2010. And I missed the appointment. And then I realized I was about to go off to graduate school at that point. So I realized I can't make another appointment. I'm out of time. I'm just going to have to live with this. So I went to graduate school and got all of the way through a master's and PhD. And I don't know if you've been to graduate school, but the thing about grad school is everyone's exhausted in grad school. It's like the definition of the experience. So when you see everyone else around you talking about how tired they are, it just seems natural to assume that the fact that you're so tired is nothing special. But after a few years, it was just insupportable, the amount of exhaustion I felt. I would be sitting on the couch 7 p.m. at night, all the lights on in the room, my husband playing a video game and talking loudly over his headphones to someone on the other end, and I would just fall asleep. I could just tell that this could not possibly. So I scheduled I talked to my student health actually, and they finally referred me to a sleep clinic. At which point I talked to the doctor. They had me do some sleep forms, some surveys. It became pretty clear that I was extremely unusually sleepy, but I still had to go through 3 sleep studies before they settled on the idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis. And that was ironically, it was in 2017. I got the diagnosis the day after I defended my dissertation and completed my PhD.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thanks. It was.
And you managed to do that all with the condition.
I did, but it's certainly a case of, my friends, my colleagues were working 60-hour weeks, things like that. I was working 20-hour weeks because I was just so tired. So I was satisfying the bare requirements. I was getting things done, but I was not getting nearly as much done as I could have. And so I got the PhD and I graduated, but I certainly left grad school with a sort of weaker background with fewer achievements than people who hadn't been struggling against this. So it's a little bittersweet knowing that if I'd not missed that first appointment all the way back in 2010, I probably would have had a much, much easier time. Those 6 years of graduate school were extremely, extremely hard on me.
Could you describe your sort of worst day with hypersomnia? What is a typical day like?
Nowadays, I'm in a pretty good place because I have a very regular sleep schedule and I take several medications. But I would say before everything, if I could sleep about 8 to 9 hours, most days I would be all right. I would be constantly aware of my sleepiness. I might yawn every 10 minutes or so. There would just be, gritty feeling in my eyes and just a sense that everything was sort of an uphill struggle. But I could generally do what I needed to do, and hopefully I wouldn't nap. That's the good day. A bad day would be if for some reason I got less than 8 hours of sleep. Anytime I had an early morning meeting, I would typically get maybe 7 hours of sleep because I found it difficult. I had such a regular schedule in many cases, I found it difficult to go to bed earlier. So if I got 7 hours of sleep or so, I would be yawning constantly. I've offended more than one person with, yawning constantly as they're talking to me. My eyelids would be drooping. Sometimes I would have to just hold my head up like this because I would just be constantly doing the little naps. And oftentimes I would have to actually nap in the afternoon, or I'd get seized by one of those sleep attacks like I described earlier, where noise, sound, time of day didn't matter. I would just have to lay down and be out for maybe half an hour.
And while you're experiencing these symptoms, were you managing through with caffeine at all?
I tried, but it turns out that caffeine has just never really had much of an effect on me. I don't know if it's related to any of my diagnoses or if it just happens to be a sort of cruel trick of nature. But it seems to be that if I've legitimately not slept enough hours, caffeine provides a very slight boost. But if I have, and this is the thing that would always confuse me, is I could often sleep 8 hours, 9 hours, feel the same way. If I've slept 8 or 9 hours, then caffeine doesn't really seem to have an effect at all. I had to teach at 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, one semester in graduate school. And that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
Yeah. And, with the sleepiness or tiredness, how would you characterize the feeling that you had?
I would say that it's a little difficult to answer because I feel that sleepiness is a little bit like pain in that it can manifest in a lot of different ways. There's sort of the low-level grinding tiredness, which I feel like you feel kind of in your eyes almost, just the heaviness, the constant desire for them to close. There's the sort of full body tiredness where just moving seems like so much effort. You could keep your eyes open and even maybe focus on things, but all you can do is sit. And then, of course, there's the acute sleepiness. This is one thing that actually still happens to me now and again, even though I'm generally coping quite well now, is I will just, often after I've been standing for a long time, I will just feel this absolute just pull towards sleep. It's almost like a, a tidal pull out in the ocean somewhere, where I have to sit down and I have to close my eyes and I have to just shut down. But I think probably the most common thing is just the sort of like constant slow drag of everything. The way that it's just like sleep is just slowly reaching out for you, and you have to constantly exert yourself, like you're tensing a muscle the whole day long, just to really stay awake and focused and in the moment.
Got it. And so have you noticed any challenges with cognition or memory or any issues of that nature?
Yeah, so thankfully, again, this is another thing that medication has helped a great deal with, but I have had a lot of brain fog, and I'll still see this on days where I don't sleep well, where I just cannot remember words. And I mean, words are kind of my thing. I love to read, I love to write, I have a very large vocabulary, but there will be days where the simplest words just escape me, and I just have to sort of keep stammering out things till eventually I get there. Memory is a particular issue as well. There's a lot of things that are just kind of gone. And they say, in cognitive psychology, they say that memory is the ghost of attention. So whatever you're able to focus on in the moment is what you'll be able to remember. But if you're so foggy and tired, you can't focus on anything, then of course you just kind of lose all of these memories. So it's definitely something that I really regret, because there's large periods of my life that are just kind of foggy in that way.
And has it impacted your work at all? I know you mentioned in graduate school, but it mentioned difficulty getting to work. I guess in the time of COVID, it's easier to get to work. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm incredibly lucky to work for just a very generous and flexible employer, because there are days, less now, certainly not at all now that we're in the COVID stage, but less now that I'm properly medicated. There have been days where I've just had to go home in the middle of the day, which is like, I'm sorry, I have to sleep. I would just go home at 2 and go right to bed and sleep for a couple hours, and hopefully manage to make up some of the work afterwards. But in many cases, often just sort of losing the day. So I'm very grateful to the flexibility that my employer allows in terms of getting my work done. It's certainly provided issues there. Also the issues with, of course, like memory and focus. I have a pretty robust to-do list tracking system, because I have to. It's just so easy for things to slip out of my mind. If someone comes by my office and asks me to do something, I often tell them I will do that, but please send me an email or send me a message on Slack, because I'm just not going to remember what you told me verbally. I needed writing. So there's a lot of these kind of small accommodations I've had to make to get around it. But for the most part, I've been extraordinarily lucky in having enough support to make those accommodations.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I ask my wife to send me emails and things like that. So could you tell me a little bit about any impacts to mood and maybe to your relationships?
Yeah, definitely. This is actually, it's subtle, but I'd say it's perhaps the thing I'm most grateful for in terms of being properly medicated, is that when I was at my worst, I was so irritable. And I hated this about myself, but it was just anything that was sort of negative or unpleasant just felt intolerable. I would remember on days that I couldn't sleep well, I have a very affectionate cat who's very, very fluffy and sweet, and he loves to come up and rub on my legs in the morning. But I can remember mornings where I was so exhausted that just the sensation of him rubbing against my legs, it felt like sandpaper, despite the fact he's soft as silk. And I would just be crying because I was trying to get the cat off me, when it's just such a sweet, innocent little gesture that most days I would enjoy. And I could sometimes, unfortunately, be short-tempered with my husband as well, because it's just, it feels like you're carrying such a burden that the slightest thing put on top of that is an intolerable imposition. I remember once he turned on the air conditioning in a super hot car, and it blasted, full force in my face. And I think I yelled at him for it. It's like, why would you do that? I mean, of course, it's just a simple mistake. You don't think to turn it down before you turn it on. But in the moment, it just felt like he slapped me in the face because I had so little ability to deal with anything. My husband is a very wonderful and patient person and never made me feel bad about any of that. But I'm very glad that that I'm better able to deal with setbacks now, because I think it really was a huge impact on my mood and relationships.
And could you describe your impact, or the impact on perhaps day-to-day activity, things that you would have wanted to do that you couldn't do because of the illness?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So for me, not having the long sleep time, I had as many hours as most people do in a day for the most part. So I certainly didn't have as much impact as people with hypersomnia who are sleeping 12, 14, 16 hours a day. But I would say probably the biggest thing was that I just didn't have energy for many hobbies at all. And for trying new things, I think was the biggest issue. So at the time, I did a lot of online gaming because this is something I could do in almost any state of exhaustion. I could just sit down, get on my computer, and game for hours, regardless of the state I was in. And I think it was probably pretty unhealthy for me. And it really displaced time I could have been spending doing things that are more interesting and important to me. I like to sew. I mentioned writing. I like to draw. I have all of these more creative interests and impulses that I really didn't indulge much during that time, because it was just, those things really do require so much energy and focus to get going. It was so much easier to just sit there and plunk away on my computer instead. So while I could certainly, on the surface, live a fairly normal life, I think a lot of it, a lot of things were stripped out of it in this subtle way.
I used to say that I had a 30% life, and when I got fixed, it went to 100%. So I know the feeling for sure. So you mentioned 2010, you scheduled a sleep study, or at least a meeting with a sleep specialist. 6 years later, you finally got 3 sleep studies. Talk to us about the sleep studies themselves. Why did it take 3? How long did that take? And that entire process with your physicians, and did you see more than one physician?
Yeah, so I should note that I did go see Student Health a couple times in the years between 2010 and 2016. I had fantastic insurance in 2010 because I was working for the state of Florida. I had terrible insurance in graduate school because graduate students have terrible insurance. So I pretty much could only go to Student Health. And I approached them a few times about this general feeling of exhaustion and weakness and low energy. And they did my blood work, said, well, everything looks fine. One of the student nurses tried to insist that I was depressed. I was not depressed. And of course, being in graduate school for psychology, I was able to make a very strong case against that. But it kind of, struck me that somebody who didn't necessarily know as much about depression and wasn't as comfortable advocating for themselves could absolutely have gotten slapped with that label, and everything ended right there. Then I was told I was dehydrated. I drank something like 80 ounces of water a day for weeks, and nothing changed. And finally, I was like, I've tried all of these things, none of them work. I think maybe it's my sleep. And so they referred me to a sleep doctor. And that process was fairly straightforward. They had me, fill out a sleep diary of how much I was sleeping. They had me try melatonin to get to sleep easier, which actually did help with that, but didn't do anything for the other symptoms. The first sleep study was the simple overnight sleep study, the PSG that they do to see if you have sleep apnea or any other explanation for your tiredness first. And I certainly didn't. I had no sleep apnea, anything else going on. For all intents and purposes, it looked like a solid 8 hours of normal sleep. They said, okay, we'll call you in and do the multiple sleep latencies test as well. And that's, they put you through the PSG, the overnight sleep study. And then the next day, they set you down in a room, and every 2 hours, they give you about half an hour to try and take a nap. They just say, okay, we're going to leave you here. We're going to lay you down in bed, turn out the lights, sleep if you can. I certainly could. I slept every one of those naps through. I fell asleep very quickly, and I slept very, very well. But the important thing about the multiple sleep latencies test is that they use it to discriminate between narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia. I'm sure you knew all this, but for narcolepsy, the distinguishing feature is that you have REM intrusion, is that you're dreaming when you shouldn't be dreaming, which certainly I have experienced just, in a sort of subjective phenomenological sense. I'm sure that I dream at weird times right when I fall asleep. But the test was inconclusive. You have to have 2 experiences of REM intrusion to count as a narcolepsy diagnosis. I had one for sure. And then the second one, the tech said that I didn't, and the doctor said that I did. And they couldn't agree on how to read the results. So they said, okay, fine, we're just going to give you another sleep study. And in that other sleep study, I again slept immediately, slept through all of the naps, but I had no REM intrusion. So they decided to give me the idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis, which was also strange because most people with IH tend to sleep for 10 plus hours a night, and I don't. I sleep slightly more than your average person. 9 hours seems to be about my sweet spot, but generally I sleep with normal sleep time, which is very unusual for idiopathic hypersomnia. But it seemed to fit my symptoms, and there was no denying that I could just fall asleep at the drop of a hat. I was extremely tired, so that's how the doctor decided to treat me.
Okay, wonderful. And so when the diagnosis was finally made, when was that, and what did the doctor recommend?
So that was April 11th, 2017, which, as I said, I remember because it was the day after my dissertation. So we started with, there were some obvious lifestyle change recommendations about keeping a very careful schedule, adhering to really good sleep hygiene, always sleeping in a dark, cool room, not staying in bed when you're not sleeping, sort of those commonplace things. But for the most part, I was already doing all of that. So the main thing that we started with was instant release Ritalin. I believe I started with something like 20 milligrams that you take twice a day. So I was on the instant release for a while, and it helped quite a bit, but it also made me a little jittery, a little nauseated, and there was a very clear pattern of I would be pretty okay in the start of the day, and then I would absolutely crash in the evenings. The evenings might have been worse than even before. And we tried different prescriptions, played around with this a little. Then, of course, I graduated and I switched over to my new insurance working for Duke University. And so I actually didn't have a specialist at that point, a sleep specialist anymore, because my old sleep specialist wasn't in network through Duke. So I thought, okay, it's fine. I'm just kind of managing this. I'm taking a standard prescription. I'll just ask my my primary care physician to do it. But it turns out that my primary care physician was very uncomfortable with prescribing this controlled medication. I had to get a new prescription every 15 days. Not just every month, which is apparently, I think, legally required, but every 15 days. And I would have to drive down physically, collect the prescription in paper form, and then take it to the pharmacy. It was kind of a nightmare. And on top of all of that, after a little while, the dose just didn't seem to be working. So I told my primary care physician and asked if we could consider upping the dosage. And she said, sure, but we need to blood test you. I said, okay. So she tested my blood, and then she came back and told me, actually, we don't see any sign that you're taking your medication in your bloodstream, so I will no longer be willing to prescribe this medication to you. And I was shocked and horrified because I had been taking my medication every single day like clockwork, so I didn't know what was going on. And as much as I had some issues with the medication, it was certainly better than nothing. So I did a little research. And it turns out that what she had done was she had run an amphetamine scan on my blood. And Ritalin methylphenidate is not an amphetamine. It will not show up in an amphetamine test. So I brought those results to her and was able to show her that, look, you didn't test me for the right thing. That's why it came up negative. And she was apologetic and quickly gave me my prescription. But then I immediately went out and sought out a proper neurologist through Duke Neurology because I was extremely unwilling to have that experience again. I didn't like the implication that I had been selling my meds and, of course, being tested for the absolute wrong thing. It bothers me because, who knows how many other people might have ended up in a similar position with this doctor or with this practice. I tried to report it, but of course, I think the report sort of disappeared into the void. And that's something that's actually come up many times for me. I think it's just the incredible privilege that I have being, someone who's educated, someone who's confident about these kind of topics. Honestly, being someone who's white, I have a lot of privileges in dealing with doctors that have made this journey so much easier for me than it might have been otherwise. There's been multiple stopping places where somebody without those privileges might have just had to live without treatment. So I'm very, very grateful. Sounds like the wrong word, but I mean, I am.
So welcome back, and maybe you take it away from how you're doing today.
Yeah, so I'm doing pretty well nowadays. What's really helpful is that I have a lot of different specialists that I work with. For a while, I tried to just have my sleep issues treated by sort of a general physician. That just didn't work out very well. So now I have a neurology specialist for everything related to sleep. I have a cardiology specialist for some other issues. I see a physical therapist on occasion. So I have a really good care team that's all kind of coordinated, or at least feeds back to my PCP, my primary care doctor. So all of that is working very well. I'd say most of the time I keep things pretty well under control by giving myself a really steady schedule, early to bed most of the time. I've been a little off this week because with the break, my sleep schedule got a little off pattern. And it's so obvious when I let myself stay up just a little late. I'll feel it for at least a whole week. So keeping a really rigorous schedule, setting an alarm most days, and even when even on the weekends, trying not to sleep in, even if I don't necessarily set the alarm. Things like that are working well for me. I try to stay active. I try to do my light physical therapy exercises a few times a week, try and get in a few walks with a longer walk on the weekend. I take some stimulants. I take extended release methylphenidate. I take that in the morning, and I also take modafinil, sometimes with an extra dose of modafinil at lunch if it's a particularly rough day, and some other medications for my other issues. And it's a pretty stable pattern, I'd say. Things aren't perfect, but I'm generally able to live a pretty normal life. I work a 40 hours a week job. I'm able to cook, do chores around the house. Sometimes certainly there are bad days where I don't have a lot of energy. I need to take a little more sick time, but for the most part, I'm managing very well, and so much better than I was even like just 5 years ago. So that's a hopeful story. I hope for a lot of people, because it's really been night and day.
Sure, and congratulations as well on getting to the place you are now. So you mentioned that 5 years ago it was sort of in a worse place. Talk to us about that journey from 5 years ago. It sounds like you were speaking with your general practitioner, and that didn't quite help you get to where you needed to be. What was the breakthrough set of moments for you?
Well, the most important thing was the initial sleep studies that I had that got me on the extended release Ritalin. That was, well, actually, I was originally on the instant release Ritalin, which just didn't work very well. And I took that for a while. So really what happened in the care journey there was going from my original sleep doctor, who I just then maintained the prescriptions that original sleep doctor gave me through my primary care doctor. So really the biggest improvement there was actually going to see my neurologist, someone who was genuinely a specialist in these kind of things, and did have experience treating sleep patients, but generally thinking about these issues as a neurological issue instead of just a sleep issue. Really helped me find someone who had a lot of expertise. And in this case, it was great because my primary care doctor had been very reluctant to prescribe my medications. I think last time I mentioned the whole issue with denying the prescription, and certainly she didn't want to really change around anything. Whereas when I spoke to the specialist, he was just so fantastically understanding. He talked about how he didn't like all the restrictions that the state necessarily put on prescribing stimulants, because as he said, this is the drug that treats the condition that you have. There's absolutely no reason you shouldn't have access to it. So that was the number one largest thing, was getting that step. But then about a year after that, I started noticing I was having a lot of other problems that weren't necessarily explicable or related to sleep, a lot of pain, weakness, stiffness, digestive problems, and the like. And that led me to going to my primary care doctor and starting the process of getting diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which is probably the actual cause of my exhaustion.
Okay.
It's probably related to the fact that I have something called Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia syndrome. I think I got that right, which basically
Right.
means that when I'm standing, my heart rate gets extremely high. Basically, my autonomic system is all out of whack, and my body doesn't really adjust very well to changes.
Okay.
And so likely this sort of like constant heartbeat is probably at least somewhat the reason why I'm so tired all the time. But even with medication for POTS and the like, I still do have a lot of exhaustion and still need to take the Ritalin. So it's very possible I do in fact have a whole laundry list of conditions, which I think is sadly pretty common for people who struggle with idiopathic hypersomnia or narcolepsy, is that there's usually something else going on as well.
Sure. And how did you figure out that you had this the rapid heart rate when you stood?
Well, it actually started. I'm trying to remember which came first, the EDS suspicion or the POTS suspicion. I think it was actually the POTS suspicion that came first, because I've had these other symptoms my whole life where if I stand up too fast, I get dizzy. I find it very difficult to stand for long periods of time. It's just strangely exhausting and the like. It's an interesting question. I think actually a coworker mentioned to me that she had been diagnosed with POTS. Is what thinking back on it now, and how she was just tired all the time. And I've long since felt, so idiopathic hypersomnia literally means we sleep all the time and we don't know why. That's the definition of idiopathic. And I've always thought that it's likely that there's something else behind this hypersomnia. There's something causing it. So I think I was always a little bit on the lookout for other explanations. So when I heard about POTS and looked into it, and the main symptoms of it being, that standing up, you often tend to feel this dizziness and you may faint. And I've nearly fainted several times in the past, just standing up too quickly. Felt like a fairly likely thing to look into. And then from there, I looked into the causes of POTS. And a very, very common cause of POTS is having hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which also then explains sort of everything else that the POTS didn't explain. So it seemed like a very likely diagnosis for me to take to my doctor and discuss, which isn't always a good thing that I would recommend and people doing. You have to obviously have a very open-minded doctor who doesn't feel like, a lot of doctors are very skeptical when you come in and say, hey, I Googled my symptoms. But in my case, I had a very good relationship with my doctor. And I have, of course, sort of academic credentials that make it, I think, a lot easier for me to be taken seriously. So it's not something I would recommend for everyone necessarily, but it was really, really helpful for me.
And so congratulations on helping to figure things out on your own. It sounds like there was some serendipity involved with meeting your coworker who described her experience. And so that's fantastic, though. That's exactly sort of the reason why we're having this conversation. As you share your experience, it gives others a sense of, things that that they might experience themselves, and maybe provide some thoughts and or things to try with their clinicians. And so that's extremely helpful. So you mentioned 5 years ago, it was in a worse place. You got to see a neurologist finally, who was more open-minded and helped you along the journey a bit further. One that you had a better way of conversing with and was able to share, and you were able to share more information about what you were experiencing, and they were open to it. And then, of course, they prescribed you the right treatments, which you are on now. And so if you could describe your experience with the treatments, were there things that were tried and dismissed, tried and failed? Was there dose finding that had to occur? What was your experience with those?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a lot of dose finding with the original instant release. I think I went up in doses once or twice with just the sleep doctor, and then needed to go up again a third time with the physician, which triggered this switch to the specialist. I found that every time I would start a new dose, I would feel jittery, a little sick to my stomach at first. And then maybe there would be a period where that would all level out, but then it would just seem like it was getting less and less effective over the long run, which is not an experience that I've had nearly as much with the extended release. it was interesting because I wasn't sure I would be able to sort of feel or recognize if a dose was right for me. I thought that would be just one of those arbitrary questions. Like I would just ask the doctor and the doctor would know what would be the right dose for me, but it really does seem to be an extremely personalized process. You hear a lot of people say that modafinil is what worked for them, and everything else was terrible, or so on or so forth. But for me, yeah, once I got in this, I think it's 20 milligram once daily extended release, that seemed to be just about perfect. I still do have some bad days. So I talked to my neurologist about something supplementary for especially bad days. And I tried armodafinil first. And it turns out that one armodafinil will keep me up forever, but not do anything to make me feel any more awake. I took one and I think I was awake for about the next 32 hours, but I was just completely out of it. So that was obviously a failure of a medication. And then I tried regular modafinil, not armodafinil. They're almost exactly the same chemically, but it's completely different. The regular modafinil helps me a little bit, but it has an incredibly subtle effect compared to the armodafinil. So it really does seem like whatever explains it, whatever sort of vagaries of body chemistry are going on there, everybody probably does have to go through some process of trying something and seeing what works and what fits. I've always heard the idea that you become tolerant to your stimulants and that you'll always have to increase your dose, or that you should take tolerance breaks. My neurologist told me that this was generally not true. And the experience I've had seems to more or less fit with that, is that I haven't needed to take breaks. But it's such a commonly repeated story that I'm not really sure which way that goes or not. I think there's a lot of myths and open questions around stimulants and stimulant use.
Sure. And sorry, I had to go on mute there for a second because of I guess someone's mowing the lawn nearby. But so wow, so there definitely was some experience there, trying different therapies, different doses of different therapies, until you finally found a solution that worked for you. So that's great that you were able to go through that journey. Talk about, your life before and after, sort of the situation you were in, and how has it changed?
Yeah, I feel like I was definitely sleepwalking a bit, kind of just living life in a fog. I was I was sort of going through the motions, but I was just really unable to focus so much. Like, if it kind of felt like if I just made one mistake, if I did one thing even the slightest bit wrong, I could just lose a day. So, sleep 7.5 hours instead of 8, and I might be useless the entire day. There was an awful lot of sitting. Even if I could get up, I would often be fairly okay in sort of the late mornings, would usually be the best time. And I could get up, I could do things. I did have a summer where I went to the gym more or less every day, even in the worst of this. But I was just constantly always tired, just constantly aware of carrying this huge weight around. And no matter what, when the evening came, I would just be completely exhausted. And I just lost a lot of time, just so much time that wasn't really used for anything productive, personally or professionally, and just so much difficulty doing really simple tasks. Like I would sit on the couch and just think about all of the things I needed to do and find it just so difficult to just get up and do them. And nowadays, of course, I don't want to say that it's perfect. All of those things still happen, but, I usually manage to get up. I take care of myself. I actually, all throughout graduate school, I had very short hair because it was just too much effort to take care of my long hair. I have quarantine length hair right now, but even so, ever since I've been properly medicated, I've had long hair again, because the sort of, 15, 20 minutes it takes to blow dry it used to just be an impossible thing to think about. And now it's just a task that I can handle. I do really have to take care of myself. I have to be mindful of the ways that I spend my energy and the things that I do with my time. But there's just, I guess you could say that I was always on a time and energy budget, but the size of that budget has gotten much larger, and the amount that individual tasks take has also gotten much smaller. So I'm just far, far more productive, especially in things that I think require really intense, focused mental effort. I have a lot less of the brain fog where I would just kind of sit there and stare at nothing and just be unable to make my brain work. A lot of that has passed, which is fantastic because I mean, I make my livelihood off being able to think and write and speak. So having that return to me has been really important. So I suppose it's a bit of an unclear answer, because I mean, in many ways I was doing okay before, but it was just so hard every day. And now I'm doing better than okay, and it's much easier.
Wonderful. And you know, this is the hardest thing to do is empathy, right? Is to put yourself in another person's shoes. And again, the purpose of Healthful Stories is to provide that opportunity. So congratulations. It sounds like you've come a long way on your journey. What advice do you have for folks who are dealing with hypersomnia, sleep issues, the other issues that you mentioned?
Oh boy, there's a lot of things I could say. I think the number one thing would be to listen to your body. You can listen to all the people around you always saying things like, oh, everyone's tired. I'm so tired all of the time. And you can listen to that and think that what you're feeling is normal. But if it doesn't feel normal, if it really feels to you like you can't live up to what everyone around you is doing and expecting, believe yourself. Something probably is wrong. And it is worth checking into. If I had believed myself sooner, my life would look probably very different. And related to that, I would also say, listen to your body's cues in the moment. If you have a good day, then maybe you can do a little bit more. If you have a bad day, then maybe you should do a little bit less. But don't actually overdo it. This is a problem I'm still working around, is when I have a really good day, I want to just do everything and I'll tire myself out for the following week. So just always, you know, it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's a good lesson to learn that in some ways you probably do have limitations that you want to live within. And yeah, it probably is important for you to, you know, set an alarm most every day and go to bed early and all of these things that may not feel very fun, but in the end, they're very much worth it. And one other thing I would add is definitely, if your diagnosis doesn't feel right or it doesn't feel like it explains everything, keep digging, because that was certainly what happened with me. Is just sleep was only a part of the issue. And when I was feeling all of this pain, all of this nausea, all of these other things, I realized there was so much more going on. It was treating those other things has had just about as much of an impact on my life as treating the sleep. I've spent a lot of time online forums for people who have hypersomnia, and one of the reasons is that I very often see them post things that suggest that they have similar issues to mine and they don't recognize it. A lot of people who say, oh, you know, I'm diagnosed with this and this is the problem, and then they'll offhandedly mention something else. And then you ask a few questions about that and you hear all of these other things are going wrong. So really think about all of your symptoms, and if you don't feel satisfied in your answer, if you can, if you have the resources, if you have the opportunity, try to keep looking, because it's never too late. When I got diagnosed with EDS, this also allowed my mom to get diagnosed with EDS at the age of 59. She has been sick her entire life, and more or less disabled for the last 10 or 20 years of her life. And she's heard a lot of answers over the years, things like fibromyalgia that, you know, might well be true, but weren't necessarily good, satisfying explanations. But it's never too late to get that explanation and figure out what's going on, because there's almost always something that can be done if you just know what's happening. So yeah, listen to your body, do what it says, and just keep asking questions, because there is always a way forward, I think, for just about everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful. And that is exactly what we want with Healthful Stories, is folks overcoming what's going on and making sure that they have the opportunity to share their journey with others. And so I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time, both times actually. And so very much appreciate you sharing your journey. You know, hopefully together we have an impact on folks who have issues that they don't know how to grapple with, they have questions about, and they just need just that little bit of inspiration from a story like yours to take their health into their own hands. So Jenna, thank you so much.
And no, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I think what you're doing is awesome. And I'm grateful for a chance to be involved. And honestly, I spend all that time on Reddit just looking for people to maybe help out a little. So it's really nice to be a part of this. So thanks.